I get a lot of music and filmmaking questions here, and the two questions I get more than any other are, number one, what the heck is going on in the pre-chorus of Mike Keneally's song Potato? And two, is that new Ali Wong show called Beef character-driven or plot-driven? So this week, since I have none idea, I'll finally answer those questions. Here we go. I'm Carl King, and this is the Carl King Podcast, where every week we learn about music, filmmaking, and creativity. If you like this show, head over to patreon.com/Carl King and join for just $1 or $5 a month. Or send a tip through PayPal or Venmo to username Carl Kingdom. Special thank you to my illusionist $51 level patrons, both Hank Howard III and Chubode. Quick shout out to my music endorsements, Vienna Symphonic Library, Fractal Audio, Ernie Ballstrings, TuneTrack, and Millennia Media. Now, let's get this episode beginned. Just a few Carl King the Human updates, and then we will officially start to get beginned. Number one, it's finally warming up here in Southern California, which is both good and bad news for me. It's good news because I'm going out for more walks and enjoying the sun, and bad news because now my podcast camera is overheating constantly. And that's because my studio, Plosive Central, is not well insulated. So last week when recording my Travis Orban interview, we could only record for 10 minutes before having to stop for 10 minutes. 10 minutes recording, 10-minute break. And it's definitely not efficient, so a camera upgrade is on the horizon. Number two, this past Friday, I finished the full-length first draft of my creative musician course called What the Heck is Music? And there's still more work to be done, but I expect it to be released this year as a 2-hour video available only to my Patreon members. And if you are a member there, you can read the entire 12,000-word script right now. And number three, this week I'm shifting my focus back to working on my new vocal-oriented song album. So I will be starting on song number 4. And at this time I have none idea what it will be, but just as with the other 3 songs, I will post a demo or whatever progress I make inside my Patreon account. And now, let's move on to this week's Analytical Filmmaking Analysis of the Week. This week's Analytical Filmmaking Analysis of the Week is Beef, Episode 1, screenwritten by Lee Sung-jin and directed by Hikari, starring Ali Wong and Steven Yeun. Beef's first episode is a perfect opportunity to talk about the difference between two types of stories, plot-driven and character-driven. And you can determine if a story is plot-driven or character-driven by asking the question, what causes the events to occur? What drives the story forward? And why is it all happening? Actually, those are 3 questions, aren't they? And we talk about plot, but what is plot or plotting? It's planning. It's charting a course or drawing a line on a map. We're starting here and we're going there. We're setting a destination in advance. It's premeditated. So in a plot-driven story, the focus is on a sequence of physical events. The writers plot out an adventure as if the characters are action figures. And the most important thing is to get them from here to there, and everything else is in support of that. In a plot-driven story, something called an inciting incident happens to the main character, which gives them a problem to solve. There's a clear, tangible goal, like rescue my daughter from the kidnappers, or rob the bank in order to pay off my gambling debts, or as simple as defeat the villain. The rest of the story is one attempt after another to achieve that single thing. It's as if the writers start with the beginning and the ending, and the scenes in between are only there because we need it to happen. So they can get from A to B to C to D, all the way to Z, and roll the credits. But there's a problem with this plot-driven method. Those things that happen in B, C, and D might not be plausible. So you'll often see characters doing things that make no sense and defying everyday human behavior, like ignoring obvious things in plain sight, making painfully bad choices that are out of character, stating facts out loud for the audience's sake, and even breaking the laws of physics. And that's what happens when writers paint themselves into a corner. The deadline arrives and, whoops, too bad, it's time to make the movie. But at least we got our characters from point A to point Z, and no one's going to notice, right? As long as the hero punches the bad guy and stops the end of the world, everyone's going to love it. But in his book called On Writing, Stephen King had this to say: I distrust plot for two reasons. First, because our lives are largely plotless, even when you add in all our reasonable precautions and careful planning. And second, because I believe plotting and the spontaneity of real creation aren't compatible. It's best that I be as clear about this as I can. I want you to understand that my basic belief about the making of stories is that they pretty much make themselves. The job of the writer is to give them a place to grow, and to transcribe them, of course. Plot is, I think, the good writer's last resort and the dullard's first choice. The story which results from it is apt to feel artificial and labored. And as a plot denier myself, I think Carl King agrees with Stephen King. So that brings us back to Beef, which is a character-driven story. Everything that happens, everything that drives the story forward, is motivated by internal psychology. The people we're watching and learning about are not serving a plot. There's no lane or track that their behavior is forced onto, like those little cars at Disneyland where you can move the steering wheel back and forth, but you're still stuck on a guided rail. There are no cartoony bad guys and good guys. There's no chaotic evil villain who only does chaotic evil things. And there's no lawful good hero who only does lawful good things. We can see the positive and negative aspects in all of the characters. They lie and manipulate each other and themselves. But they do attempt to do what they think is the right thing under the circumstances. And much of it comes from their subconscious. And since everything sprouts from that somewhat chaotic human behavior, every scene unfolds in an unpredictable way. The script feels as if it's improvised by real humans. We discover their secrets, we see them struggle with moral ambiguity, and we follow them around as they act on their own individual impulses. So with every scene, their future changes, which means the possible structure of the plot changes. They don't know what's going to happen, and neither do we. It's like every scene serves as another inciting incident, but those inciting incidents emerge from within the characters themselves. Each character makes some bad choices, but those bad choices are grounded in the context of their own life experiences. So while we might not make those exact bad choices ourselves, they do make sense. It feels like what the character would really do in a situation. And since those choices don't need to support a predetermined plot, they're free to make them. And within reason, the characters could do anything according to their nature, and not ruin the story, because the story is actually being written forward from scene to scene. And that creates a chain of causality from A to B to C. But if you retroactively try to create a chain of causality by writing the beginning and the ending first, and later you try to fill in the blanks, you probably end up with a bunch of non sequiturs and material that doesn't feel like it belongs. So as a writer, in each scene, you can ask yourself, would this really happen? And if not, you're probably forcing the character's behavior and often the laws of physics to fulfill the plot. But if your story is entirely character-driven, you could have a different problem. You might end up in a place where the story is hard to resolve. And episodes of Seinfeld can feel that way. The scenes might move from one to the next flawlessly, developing this premise, and then the episode might just end. And to me, that doesn't feel satisfying, but that's okay because most of the world disagrees with me. The main point is, when writing a character-driven story, it might be a completely different script than you expected to write. And that could be a good thing, because I suspect that's how my favorite films are written. Now, let's go through some of the character-driven moments in Beef, Episode 1. Number 1, Danny is at the store to return his hibachi grills for the third time, and instead of successfully returning them, he can't find his receipt, he's frustrated by a rude clerk, and he just gives up and decides to keep them. Number 2, because of that, Danny gets into his truck, and in a moment of intense anger, he almost punches his steering wheel, but he doesn't. And once again, holding in his unhappiness. And then, of course, the seatbelt is stuck, and he's trying to put it on, and he's like, it's always effing something. And number 3, as he's backing out of the parking spot, not looking at all where he's going, he is honked at aggressively by a BMW. The BMW pulls forward and flips him off. And the adventure begins. Now, that's our inciting incident, and it's entirely character-driven. There's no overall plot set up by this scene. There's no implied ending. He doesn't need to get home for Christmas. He doesn't need to solve a murder. Doesn't need to deliver a briefcase. He doesn't even know what he's doing. And he hasn't even thought it through. It's just plain old road rage after a bad day. So what plot could there possibly be here? And after that scene ends, at about 5 minutes in, we have the title card with the Werner Herzog quote. And for quite a while, there's no plot. It's entirely people interacting. Characters are introduced. We learn who they are, what they're unhappy about, and what they generally want out of life. On the surface, Danny and Amy both crave something similar. Danny wants to build a big house for his parents, and Amy wants to sell her business to spend more time with her family. And those are nice goals, but they're secondary. They're not the actual story here. Those are in the background. The actual story is the conflict and relationship between Danny and Amy. And if those two characters aren't going to interact again, the show would be pointless. And it's not until 28 minutes into the episode that Danny takes action related to that conflict. He finally looks up Amy's address using her license plate number, and he goes to her house, pretends to be helping her with some contracting work, and then he urinates all over her bathroom. And the episode ends with a great scene, Amy chasing Danny down the street. And that full episode is 36 and a half minutes. And there's very little plot. The majority of the story is character. And you could say, well, of course there's not much plot. It's only the first episode. It's establishing the characters and the backstory. But okay, for comparison, let's look at a plot-driven show like The Mandalorian. In episode 1, the main character goes on 2 plot-driven bounty hunting missions in a row. And until the final scene, we get no indication of anything internal driving him. It's just quest after quest. And everything that happens is related to moving those Star Wars action figures through the predetermined adventure. It's kind of a family show, so the characters have no depth or grown-up problems, and there's no internal conflict, no self-doubt, no neuroses. It's all physical and obvious and on the surface, and everyone's intentions are clearly stated through dialogue. They're not concerned with the internal. It's as if the show is written by kids playing with toys, unaware that adults develop a deeper level of psychological complexity. It seems like the deepest we get to see into Din Djarin is in the final scene when he doesn't kill Baby Yoda. And the series is now 3 seasons in, and it's still mission of the week, like a video game. Every episode, the hero flies to a planet to get something from a guy, but that guy sends him on a mission to defeat a foe. And next week, he repeats the same thing with a different planet, a different guy, and a different foe. And I can't think of a better example of something that is plot-driven. And at this point in my life, for my own totally subjective, personal, old man tastes, I want to believe a story's characters could be real people. And unfortunately, that is rare in plot-driven stories. And of course, stories can be some mixture of the two. But which do you prefer? Plot-driven or character-driven? If your answer is character-driven, I recommend Beef. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars and a little heart on Letterboxd. And now let's move on to this week's Analytical Music Theory Analysis of the Week. This week's Analytical Music Theory Analysis of the Week is Potato by Mike Keneally from his 1997 album SLUGGO. And we're going to examine what I'm calling the pre-chorus, which I consider to be 2.5 bars long, or 2 bars of 4/4 and 1 bar of 2/4. On the surface, this is a fun, lighthearted, straightforward pop song. It's got catchy diatonic verses and a mandatory sing-along chorus. But in between, there's a pre-chorus with a sequence of tense chords. And it reminds me a bit of what he did with those non-diatonic chords on his song Live in Japan from the album Dancing. So I decided I need to understand what the heck is going on. And it turns out that figuring this one out by ear, even after watching a performance of the song on YouTube, was beyond my capabilities. I sent my own video rendition of the guitar parts to Mr. Keneally, and I thought I was pretty close, but it turned out I was not. And thankfully, he gave me a video call, and he showed me each guitar chord in detail. So, disaster averted. So, let's get into it. For context, the verse is in the key of A mixolydian. And we don't spend a lot of time here, so very quickly the chords are A, D, F sharp minor, A, E minor, A, and D. And the notes in the melody, being in A mixolydian, are the same notes as D major. And overall, it's pretty consonant, and if you reduce it down, it's basically an A major sound. Now we're going to jump ahead real quick to the chorus, and we're going to say that chorus is in the key of A major because it uses the chords F sharp, D, and E. That would be the 6, 4, and 5. It does that 3 times, and then it switches to A, D, and E, which are the 1, 4, and 5 chords. And then it returns cleanly to that verse, which is also rooted in A. And that's just so you understand that the verse and chorus are both very tonal. And aside from that little Mixolydian flavor in the verse, it's total pop songwriting. But in between those 2 slices of white bread is some stinky cheese. And this pre-chorus doesn't seem to be in a single diatonic key because what chords do we have here? We've got C over B, B minor 7, G5, and then B flat, C over B flat, A over G, D over E, and then E over D. So if you collected all of the notes from that sequence and make a scale out of them, you'd have a 10-note scale going C, D, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, A, B flat, and B. So if it had a C sharp and a D sharp, it would be fully chromatic. Anyway, that's all to say that there's no way this is in a single diatonic key. Now let's look at those chords. Most of them are slash chords, and in this case it's putting a non-chord tone in the bass. Measure 1 starts with a C over B, which is mysterious and tense sounding. And when he showed it to me, I immediately said, that Phrygian thing. But it's not an easy chord to play on the guitar. He's playing a C bar chord at the 8th fret, but dropping the bar down to the 7th fret. And then he moves down to a B minor 7 at the 7th fret. And those 2 chords are followed by a rock and roll G chord played Angus Young style. Now, those 3 chords together could be considered to be in the key of G. But this is all moving so quick, it doesn't really establish a key center. And that's measure 1. Measure 2 starts with a B flat major chord in root position. There's a little bass voice movement with the notes F and E happening there under it. The F would be a 5, and the E would be a sharp 4. So there's the tiniest Lydian moment happening. And that's followed by a C over B flat, which has its own Lydian sound. And then he moves that exact chord shape down in parallel motion 3 half steps to A over G. And he made a point to explain that he hits an open A string right after that. And then he moves up to a D over E, which is like a D chord with a 9 in the bass. And in measure 3, he reverses that concept, E over D, which is an E chord with a D in the bass. And that's another Lydian moment. And that's the entire 10 beats, or 2.5 measures, leading to the chorus, which lands on an F sharp minor chord. Now, here's one way to make sense of this whole chord sequence, starting with the B flat chord in measure 2. That B flat with that little F bass notion, and C chord could be outlining the 4, 1, 5 in F. And then the next 3 chords could be outlining the 1, 4, 5 in A. If you remove the bass notes, the triads on top are A, D, and E. 1, 4, 5. Which then perfectly resolves to the F sharp minor in the chorus, and that is a classical deceptive cadence from 5 to 6. And I have none idea if this is what Keneally was thinking, but I hope to have him on the podcast soon, and I will be sure to ask him about it. So here's my creative takeaway from Mike Keneally's song, Potato. If you've written a song with a very consonant and happy verse and chorus, why not throw in a little bit of non-diatonic tension in between? As Mr. Keneally demonstrates, even 2.5 measures of chromatic dissonance does the job. And be sure to check out the entire SLUGGO album, as well as his recently released The Thing That Knowledge Can't Eat, and I will put links to purchase those albums in the show notes. Okay, that's the end of this episode of the Carl King Podcast. Remember to subscribe on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or anywhere else you listen to these dang podcasts. And if you like this show, support the creation of more episodes by joining my Patreon for $1 or $5 a month. That's patreon.com/Carl King. Or send a tip through PayPal or Venmo to username Carl Kingdom. And as always, special thank you to my $51 a month patrons at the special illusionist level, Chubode and Hank Howard III. And thank you to all of the very good friends of Carl King for listening. And as I always say, now you're going to sing.